And if you will, everybody mute their screens until we get going, and that will help, I think. And thank you all for being here today. I gratefully appreciate that. Chris, if you will, start us up.
All right.
Start your engines.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the podium the president of the Rotary Club of Jasper, Steve Lawrence.
That sounds good. Ben Laughlin, will you lead us in prayer this morning? You have to unmute yourself first, but.
Trying. There it is. It's working now. Okay, let's pray. Lord God, as we come together this afternoon with our virtual meeting, Lord, I just pray for your blessings to be upon each one as we're gathered together in this new format, and that the friendships and the relationships will grow even stronger as a result of learning how to do everyday things a different way. We pray for Rotary here in Jasper, for our district, for international, for all that they stand for. And we just pray for your blessings upon our time together today. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. And Judy Harvey, will you lead our pledge today?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you very much. And I want to recognize that we have with us District Governor Don Martin, and we always are appreciative to have him here because we know how busy his schedule is, even in the days of COVID-19. So thank you, Don. Good to see you. I also want to recognize Green Settle for being with us. Thank you, Green. We appreciate that. And I also see sitting in the dark almost is Rob Jones. There he comes. He's coming forward, and good to see you, Rob. It's been a while.
I'm incognito, Mayor. Just trying to stick in on the backside.
Okay,
no
well.
Boys in the dark.
Oh, what fun. At this time, I'm going to, without further ado, introduce to the club someone who needs absolutely zero introduction, and that would be our very own Dr. Carl McCurdy, who will talk to us about one of my favorite subjects, which is a summer reading program. So, Carl, take it away.
All right. Well, I've had the opportunity, as many of you have, to read a lot of books the last few weeks. I told my children I've done more yard work the last 6 weeks than I have in the last 6 years as things went along. Last night on the district all call, Don asked me to bring some books, and I did a little bit longer list, using some of the ones that we had used for the last 2 or 3 years. But I've got a couple of things that I always think about and I don't always remember to say. One is that remember, my tastes are very broad, and there'll be some far right authors and some far left authors. I'm not trying to make a political statement. And the other thing is I'm not telling you that you ought to read these books. I'm just giving you a list of what I've been reading. And you know, you might not like my tastes, but out of everything that I bring to you, everybody ought to find something that might appeal to them. So let me start by screen sharing, and let me see if this will work. We PowerPoint share, and there we go. Play. So starting out, popular fiction, John Grisham. This came out only about a month or 6 weeks ago, and I remembered that I had read the first John Grisham I ever read was The Firm. He made him famous over 20 years ago, and it just grabbed me, and I said, whoa, this guy is something. And I went back to Oxford Bookstore and said, is there anything else by this guy? And she said, yeah, we got a trade paperback over there of his first novel, published by the University of Mississippi or Oxford Press, and it was A Time to Kill. So he actually wrote that one first before The Firm, but he became famous for The Firm. And I've got a first edition, A Time to Kill, from John Grisham. But this one, Camino Winds, it's about Camino Island that he wrote a book about 4 or 5 years ago, and continues some of the same characters. Camino Island is probably Amelia Island, the way I get it, because they talk about how close they are to Jacksonville, Florida. And during a hurricane, somebody gets murdered. But there's a subplot going on about the possibility that a national nursing home chain has discovered a medicine that will keep unresponsive dementia patients alive longer, so they can gather more Medicare reimbursement. And so that was a kind of interesting little subplot there. If you like Grisham, he's a great storyteller. Michael Connelly, I met over 20 years ago in the Decatur Book Festival, and he had just become well known for his Harry Bosch books. So Michael Connelly wrote Bosch, and the streaming, if you haven't seen it and you like TV shows, like crime shows on TV, one of the best it's ever been done is Bosch, streaming on it's on Amazon or Netflix, one or the other. But Michael Connelly wrote Bosch. Bosch has been around now for 20-something years, and it's about time for him to retire. So, in fact, he is retiring and doing cold cases. And The Night Fire includes Bosch and his new sort of sidekick, a lady detective that works the night shift. So Connelly is introducing a new character. He also, you might remember, wrote the book The Lincoln Lawyer, and some of the books with the Lincoln Lawyer, and there's a connection between Harry Bosch and the Lincoln Lawyer that I won't give you a spoiler on that, but those are really interesting books and series to read. Stephen King's always one of my favorite. He's a prolific writer. He used to write 3, 4, 5 books a year, so many that he had to bring out some books under a pseudonym. And this is a book of short stories. This is the most recent. It came out last month. The title comes from the phrase that they use in news shows: "If it bleeds, it leads." So it's about one of the stories is about a news anchor man. If it bleeds. Baldacci he's a great storyteller, but it's almost candy to me. I can just devour Baldacci. My mother loves Baldacci too, and he writes a wide variety of stories. But this is another story about the FBI investor who cannot forget anything. And if you think that would be great to have a memory, to have a perfect memory, well, his about 6 books earlier, his wife and child were murdered, and he cannot forget anything. So he still remembers every day the pain of that murder. But another interesting story. This just came out last week. I've watched this guy. I've never met Scott Turow, but I have. His first book and his first became well known for Presumed Innocent. And you might remember it was a mini series on TV with the guy that was murdered was the DA, Brian Dennehy played the DA. He played the murdered guy. And then, what's his name at Han Solo? What was his name, Melanie? Harrison Ford played the guy who was accused of murdering Brian Dennehy. And the lawyer who got him off was Alejandro Stern, Stern, nicknamed Sandy Stern. And in Scott Turow's books, he sets them in a fictional Kendall County, which is somewhere in the Midwest, like Minneapolis or something like that. And in several of his books in the last 20 years, Sandy Stern has been the attorney. This book is Sandy Stern's last trial. And he's defending actually one of his friends, a doctor who owns a drug company, who's been accused of murder and fraud and insider trading. And this is Sandy Stern's last trial. We get back into history. This is right now one of my favorite history writers. I mentioned last time I did the list that I've been reading more history written by journalists than by historians. I've got a bunch of books written by historians. I'm using them to hold doors open. But journalists, when they write history, they really keep my attention. This guy, Eric Larson, you want to look at some of the others that he wrote. His first book was Devil in the White City. And it basically is the first, that was the story of the first serial killer in America during the Chicago World's Fair, Devil in the White City. And he's written several books since then. He wrote one called Dead Wake that was about the torpedoing of the Lusitania. And then the one before this was called In the Garden of the Beast. And the Garden of the Beast was about, from the perspective of the American ambassador to Germany in Berlin, Hitler's rise to power and the run up to World War II, and the Garden of the Beast. Now, The Splendid and the Vile came out a few months ago, and it's about Churchill and how he responded to the initial British defeats and that retreat at Dunkirk, and how they responded to the bombing of London, the year of the German bombing of London, and a very personal account of Churchill's leadership during that year. Malcolm Gladwell, Talking to Strangers. Steve and I have already talked about this book. I like Malcolm Gladwell. He wrote Blink. He wrote The Tipping Point. Talking to Strangers has one point that I want to bring out. Malcolm Gladwell shows us in Talking to Strangers that we're really not very good at telling whether somebody's lying to us or not. And because of that, we misinterpret a lot of other people's motives. And he gives examples of that. He gives examples of the research in police work and crime, and it's true research and true findings. But then he shows how some of that has been misapplied and may in fact have led to increasing the confrontations between law enforcement and especially unarmed black men. He really has a good insight into the causes of some of this and some of the things that we could do to assuage some of these conflicts that we're seeing. The next one in nonfiction is by this guy, Spillover, Animal Infections and the Next Human Pandemic. So when do you think this was copyrighted? 2012. David Quammen says the next human pandemic is going to be an animal virus that spills over into humans. He is, I read the first quarter of this book and then I passed it on to my older daughter who's teaching biology down in Cartersville at the Georgia Highland College. So I haven't finished it yet, but she and I have already started talking about it. She's reading it right now. And what he says is that as the human race has expanded and spread out in the world, that we're putting pressure on the ecology of the world, and that we should not be surprised when animal infections spill over into humans. So the people whose job it is to predict the future and to look at this kind of future, they were divided between whether the next epidemic was going to be, whether it was going to be an influenza that mutated like in 1918, or whether it was going to be a coronavirus like SARS and MERS, or one of the hemorrhagic viruses like Ebola. And he doesn't predict which one it's going to be, but he says no question the next pandemic was going to be an animal infection that spilled over into humans. So I don't know if he's happy about being able to say I told you so, but this is a pretty scary book if you want to read something like that. This one is an older book that I've been reading, and I tell you immediately that it's like digging diamonds in the dirt. So you're gonna, you have to pick through a lot of stuff, and then you find a diamond here and there. John Barry's style is a little bit dry, but there are some diamonds in this book about the 1918 influenza epidemic. After the coronavirus started, and after I did a little program for the church that my mother heard, I mentioned the 1918 epidemic, and she sent me a text, and she said, we've probably never talked about this very much, but the reason I didn't have a grandmother when I was growing up is because my grandmother, she said, died in the influenza epidemic in 1918. So during the lockdown, one of the things that Melanie and I did was on a Saturday a few weeks ago, we just loaded up just the two of us, and we went to four graveyards that day on Saturday. Two in Georgia and two in Alabama, and I found my great grandmother's gravestone, and she, in fact, Azodi Bethuel Dean McGuire, died December 15th, 1918, in the influenza epidemic. This tells about the city that was hit the hardest, which was at that time was Philadelphia. And the reason Mr. Barry thinks they were hit the hardest is because it was the politics in Philadelphia at that time were the most corrupt of any city in America, even more corrupt than Tammany Hall. And the health director was a hack. He was a political hack, and he did not make the decisions that needed to be made. That's Mr. Barry's proposition. So there's some interesting things about the 1918 epidemic that that you might find in this book. So almost finished here. Jocelyn Jackson, I've mentioned her before. Her first book was called Gods in Alabama, and it was a hit among folks around here. She came up when that first book came out and talked to the local friends of the library. And I'll tell you, she is just as cute as a button. And the old fellas, and I wasn't that old back then, but the old fellas went gaga over Jocelyn. She lived in Powder Springs. She has since written at least a half a dozen books. They've all been bestsellers, and she's moved to Decatur. And my daughter was in yoga class with her back when she was with the DA's office in Decatur. And Jocelyn is just a little jewel. Never have I ever. Very interesting about grown-up girls being mean to each other. Carried over from the high school lunchroom, and this is grown-up women being mean to each other in a subdivision and trying to one-up each other, and it even gets down to murder. And the last one on my list is Cassandra King Conroy. Cassandra King was a writer. I met her about 15 years ago at Spolito as she was doing a talk, and she had written a book called The Sunday Wife. She had originally been married. Her first marriage was to a Methodist minister, and a Sunday wife was her account of being married, being a Methodist minister's wife. She was pretty interesting. She talked about their first pastorate. They moved into the pastorium next door, to the parsonage next door, and she woke up on Saturday morning, and somebody's going through her house, and she gets up, and it's some of the women of the church. Basically, they just considered the parsonage to be part of their property. So she realized, as they went from one pastorate to another, she was going to have to set rules. You can come in the kitchen, you can come in the living room, but when you go back through this hallway, that's our place. That's private. You don't want to see the pastor in his jockey shorts. So she was pretty effective with that, but eventually divorced. Met Pat Conroy, and if you remember Pat Conroy, he was a troubled soul. I love Pat Conroy. He wrote The Great Santini. He wrote Prince of Tides. He Beach Music. His very first one was The Water is Wide, which was made into a movie with John Voight called Conrack, which was an account of his year teaching a one-room schoolhouse on Daufuskie Island. Pat Conroy died with pancreatic cancer, and he owed us a book. He still owed us a book when he died, and he said that. He acknowledged that before he died. And Cassandra was married to him for about 15 years, and Cassandra was his reward for the hard life that he had before he met her. And this book is a love story, is a Cassandra King, Pat Conroy love story that I will recommend it to you, because he's such a part of Southern writing, and she was very good for him before she died. So that's it. It's just a short list. And let me stop sharing here. And short list in a short program, and that's about all I've got.
So would you take a few questions if some people out there might have them for you?
Sure.
So
I have questions.
go ahead.
I have a question. Especially your first 5 authors, those are 5 of my 6 favorites. I like Herman Wilke also. But on John Grisham and David Baldacci, you mentioned that there were some of the same characters. What are the characters? Because I've read almost everything John Grisham's written. I'd be interested in know.
And I didn't mean the same characters between authors, but John Grisham.
No. Like John Grisham has recurring characters sometimes.
Yeah. So the John Grisham, this is the second book written about that fellow who ran the bookstore on Camino Island. If you remember Camino Island, there was a guy he was involved in antique furniture fakery and art theft. And with his profits, he bought a bookstore on Camino Island.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, his girlfriend is involved in antique sales. It's basically the second book with that character.
Okay.
And then the Baldacci character, I'm blanking on his name now, but the guy who was a football player and he got hit in the head, and when he woke up, his memory was changed. And he was a local. He went from the NFL to be a detective, and then was hired by the.
Oh yeah. Okay.
So that's the character in the Baldacci. I mentioned the Michael Connolly and the Scott Turow as being also continuing characters.
Yeah, I like Pat Conroy too, so I'm looking forward to reading Tell Me a Story. I read all Pat Conroy's books too.
Cassandra is a jewel, and she adored Pat Conroy. And you talk to the Citadel graduates, they hate Pat Conroy because of what he wrote about the Citadel, My Losing Season, and what was that big expose he wrote about harassment at the Citadel? Lords of Discipline was about harassment at the Citadel. But then he wrote a love story about his favorite teacher at the Citadel called The Boo. So you might remember those from Pat Conroy. But Pat was such an ambivalent, and he was the kind of guy who would say, gee, why don't you love me? Oh, you do. I'll see you later. You know, he was just a very complex character. And I'm so glad that he and Cassandra were together in those last years before Pat died.
Yeah, that sounds interesting. I'm going to read that one.
Steve, can I have just a second?
Of course.
Yeah. Well, one, I want to congratulate Carl. He did a great job last night on the district all call. We had 3 directors of Rotary International on the call, and they were all complimentary of what a great job he did. And I need to send you the chat, Carl. There were a lot of folks that were interested in some of the books. They may want to ask a question or two of you. A couple of them want to have you come to their book club. I would tell you that after you finished last night, I went to download. I'm a huge Harry Bosch fan, so I went to download The Night Fire, and that's actually book 3 in the Renee Ballard series. So I downloaded all of those, and I started on the first one last night. Thanks for turning me on to that.
That's her name. She's a great character. So she's a single woman who has a dog, and basically she's gotten crossways with a couple of men in the Los Angeles Police Department, and she's been demoted to the night shift. Well, her demotion, she works the night shift, and then during the day, she takes her SUV out to the beach, pitches a tent, and sleeps during the day on the beach. And she solves these cases. She and Harry together are solving some cold cases.
Any further questions for Carl about his book report? Okay, if not, I'm going to move on to announcements. And there are 2 dates that I have of interest, and there may be others by others, but the first will be June the 13th. And Don, if you would like to say something about that particular date, then we would love to listen.
Sure. I mentioned it before, so you should be aware of it, but that will be the evening event for the district awards program that replaced what we would have been doing over 4 days at district conference. So we're actually going to spread it out just a little. We'll begin presentations on a Facebook post on Thursday, and there'll be another Facebook post on Friday, a video, and then another one on Saturday morning of some of the club awards and a few of the individual awards. And then on Saturday night, the 13th, starting at 6 o'clock, we'll do a live session to present the Club of the Year awards and the major individual awards. And we're working on bringing something of the same quality that you just got in district assembly, as far as being able to hear and see what's going on and tell a good story. So I hope you'll join us. Sounds outstanding.
And that was at 6 o'clock on Saturday night, the June the 13th.
That's correct.
On June the 17th, we will have our transition program. We're still working on exactly how we're going to do all of that. I got Chris, thank goodness, and Josh. We are going to be at the Conservancy. We'll have a few people that will be present there, and then we will zoom out to the rest. Hence, that's why I need the technical expertise of Josh and Chris to do that Zoom. So, but the time has changed because of the vote that we had. Then we will be doing the transition at 12 o'clock, our regular meeting time on June the 17th. So now, if anyone else has any further announcements, this would be a great time to let us all know.
Hey, Steve, this is Josh. I wanted to thank everybody again. I'm continually blown away by the generosity that's displayed by this community. Thanks to a lot of folks on here and a couple of donations that came in overnight. My final total for the first readers was $2,273. So that was made.
Yay!
That was outstanding. And by the way, I think that won everything, I think.
I was told that it did. The police officer looked at me like I had three heads when he arrested me. He didn't know that I had a handcuff key in my pocket. When I got out of the patrol car, I just kind of handed him his cuffs back, and it was a good time.
I wish we had a video of that.
It actually is on video. My mom live streamed it.
Oh, that's wonderful. So thank you, Josh, for everything that you do to help us facilitate our meetings. And thank you, Chris Morrow, for the planning that you're going to do soon to help us do this Zoom with that new camera you have.
Cassie, this is Judy. Are you on the call?
Yes, ma'am.
Do you want to say one last time what the opportunity is for people to participate in the clay shoot for the Boys and Girls Club?
Sure. We have a clay shoot next Friday, June the 5th. It's actually at Garland Mountain, and we're really excited. We have 23 teams signed up, and a full course is 25, so that's huge. So that means we have 2 open team spots left. So if anybody's interested, I do have to turn in my final numbers by actually tomorrow at 5 p.m. So if anybody is interested, please let me know. And if you don't have to have a full team, you can just come by yourself. I also have some individuals that I end up pairing together, or if you have 2 people or whatnot. So that's next Friday. And letting everyone know we are opening on Monday with kids at the club for summer camp. So it's going to look a little different, but we're really excited.
Thank you. And I also want to recognize that we have Kayla Hollifield with us, and everybody wave to Kayla. And thank you for being with us today. And hopefully one of these days, if we ever resume, she can get to see us all meet in person. And I would be appreciative of the opportunity to have her join our club. But in any case, thank you so much for visiting with us, Kayla.
Thank you for having me, Steve.
Okay, so anything else, sir? Max, did I hear you?
Steve, let me, yes, sir. You want to mention about Nathan Hamilton on the 10th?
Please, I will let you bring that to the club. Thank you.
Okay. Well, we have a scholarship winner, Nathan Hamilton, a senior at Pickens High, and his essay in the Laws of Life contest won for the 12th grade, and he's going to the University of Georgia, Go Dogs, of course. And so he's going to be with us on June the 10th to read his essay, and hopefully we'll be able to have our sponsor and one more young lady read that day who placed 17th in the state. So that's on June the 10th at our regular meeting. Thanks, sir.
Thank you, sir. We'll talk later about that other one as far as time goes. I also want to recognize Gina Penley today because that's what John Snavy would look like if he could. And so we appreciate so much you being with us today. Thank you for doing that, doing our secretary's duties. So any further announcements by anyone? If not, I gratefully appreciate everyone being here. And Josh, if you will, everybody unmute and let's say our four-way test of the things we think, say, and do.
Is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill?
Goodwill and better friendships. And will it be beneficial to all concerned? Thank you so much, and thank you, Dr. Carl, for doing such a wonderful job as always.
Thank you.
Great weekend, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
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 Bye.